The king had dismissed 47 women in 3 days, and the Silver Court was holding its collective breath to see what would happen next. The selection had been planned for months. His council had spent the better part of a year arranging it, reaching out to PACs across the 30 northern territories, setting criteria, issuing invitations, preparing the Silver Hall, briefing the candidates on protocol. It was, by every measurable standard, a well-organized event. And it was, by Kaelin's private assessment, the most exhausting thing that had happened to him in 6 years of ruling. Nobody said this directly to his face. The advisors standing along the Great Hall's stone walls had learned over time which conversations to avoid with Kaelin, and this was near the top of that list. They kept their records and their quiet opinions, and watched as the 48th candidate walked through the polished double doors at the far end of the hall, with the same measured, deliberate grace that every candidate before her had used. It was a particular kind of grace, Kaelin had noted by the second day. It was the grace of someone who had practiced their entrance. Her name was Vivian. She came from the Ashwood Pack in the Eastern Hills, the daughter of a general who commanded the largest independent fighting force in the Northern Territory. She was 26, tall, composed, and had the kind of presence that made a room rearrange itself slightly in her direction when she entered. She was brilliant, genuinely, and demonstrably so. She had helped negotiate 2 inter-pack treaties before the age of 24. She spoke 4 languages. She had personally researched the trade patterns of the Northern Corridor and had brought a hand-drawn map with her annotations in the margins. She was everything the court said a future queen should be. And she knew it, which was the problem. Edmund, the king's chief advisor, watched her from his position, 3 paces to the king's right, and noted, in the private section of his mind, that he rarely shared with anyone, that Kaelin had already understood all of this within the first 2 minutes of her entrance. He could tell by the way the king's expression had settled into that particular stillness of his, the one that looked like patience, and was actually something else entirely. Kaelin's stillness was not the stillness of a man at rest. It was the stillness of a man who had retreated to a very safe internal distance, while his body remained present in the room. Edmund had learned to recognize it. He had seen it in every one of the previous 47 meetings. The 48th candidate spoke for 40 minutes. She was excellent. She outlined the strategic benefits of an Ashwood alliance with clarity and specificity. She referenced 3 decisions Kaelin had made in his first 2 years as king, and demonstrated how her own values aligned with those decisions, which showed she had done her research. She had prepared for this the way a general prepares for a campaign, which made sense given who her father was. She had identified the objective, researched the terrain, designed the strategy, and was now executing it with disciplined precision. And Kaelin sat across from her with his silver eyes focused and his face unreadable, and when the 40 minutes were finished, he thanked her with the same quiet courtesy he had used for the previous 47, and he told Edmund she could be shown out. The room shifted slightly when she left. The 2 attendants near the back wall exchanged a glance. Edmund wrote something in his record book. Gerald, standing to the left of the main table, pressed his lips together in the specific expression he used when he was containing a response that would not be appropriate to express. Vivian herself walked out with the composure of a woman who had done everything correctly and was reasonably certain of the result. She had not done everything incorrectly. She had done everything correctly. That was the thing Kaelin could not seem to explain to anyone in a way they would understand. After she left and the doors were closed, Edmund stepped slightly forward and said, in the quiet voice he used for direct communication, "The Ashwood candidate is widely considered the strongest political match of the entire selection." Kaelin said he was aware of that. Edmund waited. Nothing more came. Gerald spoke then, in the careful tone of someone managing a great deal of internal pressure. He said the council would need a decision before the end of the week. He said 3 pack leaders had already sent inquiries about the selection's timeline. He said the alliances contingent on the outcome were growing unstable with every passing day. He said all of this with the measured delivery of a man who has spent decades communicating difficult things diplomatically, but underneath the diplomacy the frustration was clearly present. Kaelin stood up from the throne and said the council would have a decision when he had made one. He said it without irritation, and without apology, and without any indication that he found this an unreasonable position. Gerald wrote something in his record book. He wrote it with slightly more force than was strictly necessary. The day continued. 4 more candidates. By the time the evening settled over the silver court, and the hall was empty, and the staff had come to reset the chairs and extinguish the secondary lights, the number stood at 52. 52 women had sat across from the white Lycan king in his silver hall over the course of 3 days, and he had found nothing in any of them that made him want to stay in the conversation one moment longer than required. He wasn't sure how to say this in a way that wouldn't sound ungrateful or arrogant. He had sat across from women who were genuinely remarkable by every standard the territory used to measure such things. They were intelligent, accomplished, politically significant, and many of them were interesting people who, in different circumstances, he might have enjoyed talking to. He did not doubt any of that. He didn't dismiss them. He simply couldn't find himself in any conversation with any of them. He couldn't locate a single moment where the careful preparation slipped, and he was looking at the actual person, rather than the person's most strategic version of themselves. And without that, without one real and unmanaged moment of honest human contact, he could not bring himself to make a decision that would shape the rest of his life. Edmund walked with him through the corridor after the last candidate left. He didn't push, because Edmund never pushed. He walked alongside Kaelin through the wide main corridor of the Silver Court, with the measured pace of a man who has learned that his most useful quality is knowing when not to speak. Kaelin spoke eventually. He asked Edmund a question. Out of everyone who had come through the hall that day, had any of them said anything that surprised him? Not clever things or well-prepared things. Genuinely surprising things. Things he hadn't seen coming. Edmund thought about it. He stood for a moment in the corridor with his record book under his arm, and actually considered the question with the thoroughness it deserved. Then he said no. Kaelin nodded once and said goodnight and turned toward the northern wing. Edmund stood in the corridor for a moment after the king had gone, watching the space where he had been. Then he wrote one final note in his record book and went to find his supper. The Silver Court contained several distinct atmospheres at any given time. The formal wings, where the selection was happening, existed in a state of carefully maintained performance. Everything arranged, everything lit for the best impression, everyone moving as if they were being observed, because they were. The council chambers held a different kind of tension, the kind that builds slowly in rooms where difficult decisions are discussed and deferred, and finally forced into the open. The outer courtyards operated at the pace of delivery schedules and maintenance tasks, the practical rhythm of keeping several hundred people housed and fed. And the kitchen wing, which occupied the back half of the court's lower level, was something else entirely. It was warm and loud, with honest noise, and smelled of real things, bread and broth and clean water, and the sharp, familiar smell of fresh vegetables being prepared. The hierarchy of the kitchen was based entirely on competence, on who could manage a large cooking fire without instruction, on who turned up before dawn without being reminded, and stayed until the work was done without being asked. It operated by its own logic, at its own pace, and it had very little interest in the Silver Hall or the women who were competing in it. The king, crossing through the narrow service corridor that connected the north wing to the kitchen passage, was thinking about Edmund's answer. No surprises, 52 women, and not one moment he hadn't seen coming. He was not, he told himself, an unreasonable man. He understood the political logic of the selection. He understood the value of a high-ranking alliance through marriage, the signal it sent about stability and succession, the practical benefit to the territory. He had agreed to the selection. He had sat in that silver hall because he understood that some things were important, even when they were exhausting. But he was also, underneath all of that, a man who had been effectively alone for 6 years, in a position where real solitude was nearly impossible, and he had learned in that time to recognize the difference between company and genuine connection. He had been surrounded by company for 3 days, 47 conversations, not one moment of real connection. He turned the corner in the service corridor and walked directly into someone coming from the other direction. It was not violent. Neither of them had been moving quickly. But it was sudden and entirely unexpected, and the woman he had walked into was carrying a wide wooden tray loaded with covered dishes, and the impact sent the tray tilting sharply. A ceramic pot of soup at the near edge slid forward. The lid shifted. Liquid poured over the tray's edge and splashed across the sleeve of his coat. He stopped. She gasped and pulled the tray back upright, catching it with a practiced adjustment of her arms. She looked up at him. She had dark, wide eyes and a practical face with no decoration about it at all, and she was wearing the plain dark uniform of the kitchen staff, and she had absolutely no idea who he was. That last part was immediately and completely clear in the way she looked at him. Not with the particular quality of careful assessment that everyone in the formal wings used when they looked at him. Not with the specific calculation that appeared behind the eyes of people who were trying to determine how useful he might be to them. She looked at his sleeve, then at his face, then at his sleeve, and what he saw in her expression was simple and direct concern. Not performed concern. Not concern she had decided would be strategically useful to display. Just the honest, immediate concern of someone who has accidentally hurt a person and wants to fix it. She said she was sorry. 3 plain words with nothing attached to them. Then she said she would get something cold for that, referring to the burn that was starting to make itself felt through the wet fabric of his sleeve, and she set the tray carefully against the wall with the brisk efficiency of someone who doesn't want to leave a problem unattended even for a moment, and she walked back the way she had come. He stood in the corridor and watched her go. She came back in under 2 minutes. She was moving quickly, and carrying a clean cloth soaked in cold water, and a small tin that he didn't recognize. She came back to where he was standing, set the tin on the narrow ledge along the wall, held the cloth toward him, and asked quietly if she could put it on the burn. He said yes. She pressed the cold cloth to his wrist, where the liquid had landed, and the skin had reddened. Her hands were steady. She was not shaking. She was not performing care. She was treating an injury the way someone treats an injury when they know how, which is to say efficiently, with complete attention on the task, and no attention on anything else. She opened the tin. A pale cream inside, herbal in smell, familiar in a way he couldn't immediately place. She applied a small amount to the reddened skin, with careful precision, and said it would take the sting out by morning. Then she stepped back, picked up her tray, adjusted its weight in her arms, apologized once more for the accident, and walked away down the service corridor, without a backward glance. He stood in the dim corridor for a long time. He didn't know her name. He didn't know which pack she had come from, or how long she had been at the Silver Court, or what her work involved, beyond carrying trays through back passages. He knew almost nothing about her. But he knew one thing, with complete clarity. She had looked at him, and seen a man with a burned wrist, who needed cold water. Not a king, not a throne, not a political opportunity, not something to be assessed and managed and used. A person who had been hurt, in a small and ordinary way, and who was better for having the injury attended to. It was the most ordinary thing that had happened to him in 3 days. He turned around and walked back toward his chambers. 2 guards fell into step behind him at a respectful distance. He didn't acknowledge them. He walked through the main corridor and up the stairs to the North Tower, and he sat down at his desk where the council reports were waiting for him. He could not read them. He was thinking about the flour smudge on her left forearm. He was thinking about the small healing cut on her right hand, the kind you get from working with knives or sharp edges over a period of days. He was thinking about the way she had said, "I'll get something cold for that," with no pause before it, no calculation, no checking of his face to see what response would be most useful. He told himself he was reading too much into a very ordinary moment. He was exhausted. 52 conversations in 3 days had worn him down. And in that worn-down state, he was assigning meaning to a 3-minute interaction in a service corridor that was, objectively, nothing more than a kitchen worker treating a minor burn. He told himself this. He mostly didn't believe it. In the morning, the first thing he did, before the correspondence, before the patrol reports, before the council agenda, was ask Edmund for the full personnel list for the kitchen staff currently assigned to the Silver Court. Edmund wrote this down without changing his expression. He said he would have it on the king's desk before noon. He had it there by 9. Kalen found the name 2/3 of the way down the page. Marin. Place of origin, Greyfen Borderland Pack. Duration of current placement, 3 weeks. Assigned work, general kitchen support. He read it twice. Then he put the list in his desk drawer, went to his morning council session, and said nothing about any of it. But in the quiet behind everything that was said in that session, in the part of his mind that had not been involved in managing an alliance negotiation or reviewing border patrol data, he was thinking, Marin, from the Greyfen borderland. He was thinking, she never asked my name. Marin had come to the Silver Court 3 weeks earlier, with a single bag, a letter of referral, and the particular calm composure that comes not from confidence, but from having survived enough difficult things to know that another one is rarely the end of the world. The letter was from Elder Wynne of the Greyfen pack. 2 handwritten pages on plain paper, carefully worded, explaining Marin's work history and reliability and good character. Elder Wynne had written it at her kitchen table on a Thursday evening, with Marin sitting across from her drinking tea, and she had said everything an honest person could say about a young woman she had known since birth. She had been careful with the words, Elder Wynne, precise and spare the way she was with everything, and she had not overstated a single thing. The Greyfen pack occupied a stretch of borderland in the far northern reaches of the territory. It was a collection of families, rather than a formal pack in the traditional sense, small enough that the larger packs had long since forgotten to include it in any official count. They had their own land, their own traditions, their own ways of doing things that didn't always match the customs of the southern and eastern territories. They were not poor in the way that means struggling to eat. They were poor in the way that means no influence, no formal standing in the structures that shape the world around you, no voice in the decisions that affect your life. Marin had grown up understanding this quietly and completely. She had understood it the first time a representative from a larger pack had visited Greyfen and spoken to Elder Wynne the way adults speak to children, slowly and clearly, and with the particular patience of someone who has already decided that the person across from them doesn't need to be taken seriously. She had been 11. She had sat in the corner of the meeting room and watched Elder Wynne receive this with dignity and calm, and she had stored the observation away in the place where she kept things she wasn't ready to use yet. What she had learned from the storing of it was this: the world sorted people into visible and invisible, and the visible ones set the rules, and the invisible ones could either fight the sorting or find a way to work within it that preserved what mattered. She had chosen the second option, not because she lacked the spirit for the first, but because she was practical, and practicality told her that a fight she couldn't win used up resources she needed for everything else. So she had become very good at invisible. She was good at moving through a room without disturbing it. She was good at completing significant amounts of work without drawing attention to the doing of it. She was good at listening, which was a skill that most people underestimated because they confused it with passivity. Listening was not passive. Listening was the most active thing she did. She listened the way other people planned, with her full attention and all of her intelligence, and what she heard told her things that most people missed entirely because they were too busy thinking about what they were going to say next. She was 22. She had worked in the Greyfen communal kitchen since she was 14, first as a helper to the older women, and then as the primary cook, as her skills quietly outgrew the small operation. She had learned practical medicine from the pack's healer. During the 2 years the healer was too ill to manage emergencies alone. She could repair most fabrics and some leather. She could navigate by the stars when necessary, a skill she had learned from an old man in Greyfen, who said it was the one kind of knowledge that nobody could take from you. She had the kind of memory for practical information that made her an extremely useful person in any situation that required common sense, and the ability to stay calm when things went wrong. None of this had ever made her important to anyone outside of Greyfen. The opportunity at the Silver Court had come through a connection Elder Wynne had maintained for 20 years, a quiet woman named Clara, who had worked in the court's permanent household staff since before Marin was born, and who still sent a letter to Greyfen every spring, reliable as the season itself. Clara had written in her most recent letter that the King's selection event would require additional kitchen support for several weeks, and that if Elder Wynne knew of anyone reliable and discreet, she should send word. Elder Wynne had set the letter down and looked at Marin across the kitchen table. Marin had looked back at her. They had not needed to have the conversation out loud. Marin had gone home and packed her bag. She arrived at the Silver Court by supply carriage on a cold morning 3 weeks before the selection began, which meant she arrived before most of the noise and preparation had reached its peak, and which meant she had time to learn the geography of the place before it filled with people who expected her to already know where everything was. She was shown to the kitchen wing by a young man with a clipboard, who looked at her letter, nodded, and told her to find Clara and follow her instructions. He said it the way people say things when they're managing a large logistics operation, and every individual element of it is simply one more item to be directed to its correct location. She found Clara in the main kitchen, a compact woman in her mid-40s with gray-threaded hair pulled back from her face, and the brisk manner of someone who spent no time on unnecessary things. Clara had looked at the letter, handed it back, and said, You carry yourself quietly. That's good. I need someone in the East Supply Corridor, and someone who handles the early morning fire on weekdays. Do you have a problem with early mornings? Marin said no. Clara said, good. You start tomorrow at 5. Don't be late. And she had gone back to what she was doing before Marin arrived, which was managing a supply inventory. And that was the entirety of Marin's orientation to the Silver Court. She was not late. Not once in 3 weeks. Her room was small, on the lower-level staff corridor, shared with a young kitchen worker named Edith, who was 17, and had arrived only a week before Marin, from a small pack in the Southeastern Territory, and who was, in the specific way of people who are trying hard not to show it, deeply homesick. Marin recognized it immediately. The way Edith's eyes went to a middle distance during mealtimes. The way she tidied their shared room in the evening, with the particular focus of someone who is keeping their hands busy, so their mind can't wander too far. The way she was very cheerful to everyone she spoke to, which was the kind of cheer that takes a lot of effort to maintain. Marin didn't press. She didn't ask pointed questions or offer advice that hadn't been requested. She simply made sure there was always some of the better bread saved for Edith at the end of the day, because she had found over the years that small, practical kindnesses worked more reliably than conversations when you were trying not to think about home. Edith had noticed and had said thank you the first time, and Marin had said it was nothing, and they had established between them the particular kind of comfortable warmth that doesn't require much discussion to maintain. The work itself was familiar in its nature, if not its scale. The Silver Court kitchen operated at a size that took Marin several days to fully comprehend. Dozens of staff working across multiple shifts, multiple fires running simultaneously. A hierarchy of tasks and responsibilities that had to be coordinated across the day with very little margin for error. Meals for hundreds of people, dietary requirements, supply chains, equipment maintenance, the constant low-level emergency management that any large kitchen operation involves. She learned quickly, asked questions when she didn't know something, and only when she didn't know something, and made no fuss about any of it. Louisa, who was the head of the kitchen hierarchy, and who had run this specific operation for 18 years, had noticed Marin in the second week. She had watched her handle a supply problem, a wrong delivery that needed to be urgently corrected before the next morning's meal service could proceed, with a calm efficiency that saved the day's schedule without anyone outside of the supply chain needing to know there had been a problem at all. Afterward, Louisa had said quietly to Clara that the girl from the borderland had good instincts and better judgment than most of the experienced staff. Clara had said she knew, which was why she had sent for her. Louisa was a tall, solid woman, in her early 60s, with the calm authority of someone who has been genuinely expert at something for a very long time, and has stopped needing anyone to acknowledge it. She had maintained her kitchen through kings and councils and crises and celebrations for nearly 2 decades, and had developed the particular steadiness of someone who has weathered enough to stop being surprised by storms. Marin recognized the quality. She had seen it in Elder Wynn. It was the quality of someone who has learned to trust themselves completely. What Marin had not fully anticipated was what it would feel like to be in the building while the selection was happening. She had known the selection was occurring. Everyone in the territory knew. The king's selection had been announced 3 months earlier, and had been the subject of conversation in every pack, including Greyfen, for all that time. But knowing about it from a distance, and being physically present in the space where it was occurring, were different experiences, and the difference became clear to her on the second day, when she carried a supply tray through the main service corridor, and passed within 3 feet of 4 elaborately dressed women, who looked through her the way you look through a window. The selection candidates moved through the formal wings in a way that occasionally overlapped with the corridors Marin used for supply runs. Most of them were simply indifferent to the staff, in the way that people who have always had others attending to their needs can be. Not cruel, just comprehensively unaware that the people providing those services had any inner life worth accounting for. A few were actively gracious, and one young woman from the Western Packs, who had hair the color of autumn leaves, always said please and thank you to every staff member she encountered, in a way that felt entirely uncontrived, and Marin noticed and appreciated it. But there were others who moved through the court spaces, as if the people maintaining those spaces had roughly the same status as furniture. One candidate had extended a tray in Marin's direction, without looking at her, or breaking her conversation with her attendant, simply placing it in the air between them, because there was always someone positioned to receive things in these environments. Another had asked Marin to move aside in a corridor. Not impatiently, just automatically, the way you'd shift a chair that was in an inconvenient position. Marin had moved. She had taken the tray. She had done both things without comment. This was not weakness. It was the practiced invisibility that had been useful to her for years, and she had long since stopped hearing it as a personal verdict on her worth. She knew what her worth was. She simply kept that knowledge in a private place, where it didn't depend on anyone else's acknowledgement to remain true. She was not here for the selection. She was here for the work, and she did the work with complete attention and left the rest of the court to manage itself. On the evening of the third day of the selection, she had been in the service corridor doing a supply run when she had turned a corner and walked into someone coming the other way. She had dealt with it the only way she knew how. She had treated the burn, apologized, picked up her tray, and left. Back in the kitchen, she had mentioned it briefly to Clara. The collision, the soup, the burn, that she had treated it. Clara asked who the man was. Marin said she didn't know. Tall, a silver coat. She hadn't asked his name. Clara had gone still for just a moment, a brief, internal stillness that Marin noticed but didn't interpret, and then said she would mention it to Louisa in case a formal record of the incident was needed. Marin said that was fine, and went back to her work. She didn't think about the man in the silver coat again that night. She thought about the bread in the third oven, and whether the morning delivery would arrive on time, and whether Edith's homesickness was improving. She thought about the letters from Elder Wynne that she kept folded inside her book, and about the particular smell of the Grey Fen communal fire, which was different from the Silver Court kitchen fires in a way she couldn't precisely name. She did not think about silver eyes in a dim corridor. She did not think about the look on the man's face after she left, which she had caught in the last half-second before she turned the corner. The particular expression of someone thinking very carefully about something that had just arrived unexpectedly. She noticed things like that. She always had. She filed them and didn't always open the file again. She simply went to bed, and in the morning she got up before 5, lit the kitchen fires, started the bread, and went about her day in the quiet, purposeful way she always did. The kitchen staff list sat in Kalen's desk drawer for 2 days before he did anything with it. He hadn't intended to leave it there. He had put it in the drawer that first morning with the specific intention of taking it out again that evening when he had more time to think clearly, and then the second council session had run 3 hours longer than scheduled, and then Gerald had called an emergency meeting about the Eastern Alliance discussions that were apparently becoming difficult, and then the evening border reports had arrived and needed his attention before they went stale, and the list had stayed in the drawer. He had let it stay. He knew her name, Marin. He said it once, privately, the way you test the sound of something you're not sure yet what to do with. It was a plain name, no extra syllables, no imported elegance. It suited what he knew of her, which was not much, and was somehow enough to think about. He went to the council session with Gerald, on the second day, and sat through 2 hours of carefully presented concern. Gerald had prepared a written document. He had brought correspondence from 3 different pack leaders, who were requesting information about the selection's timeline. He had arranged everything in order of urgency, and laid it out on the table, with the thoroughness of a man who prepares his arguments the way some people prepare for battle. Kalen read through the correspondence. Pack leader Aldrich of the Stonebrook territory wanted a resolution within the week. A representative from the Eastmore pack had sent a more diplomatically worded note that conveyed the same urgency with considerably more dressing. The third letter was from a collective of 3 smaller packs in the western foothills who had daughters in the selection and wanted to know what was happening. Kalen set the letters down and said he was aware of the timeline and would have something for the council before the end of the week. Gerald said that was the same answer he had given 3 days ago. Kalen said yes, it was, and thanked Gerald for the meeting. Gerald bowed and left with his papers, and with the specific dignity of a man who has delivered his message and is preserving his composure by not saying everything else he is thinking. After the council chamber cleared, Kalen walked back to his office through the longer route, the one that passed by the service passage entrance. He stood outside the closed wooden door for a moment. From inside, he could hear someone giving clear, precise instructions about the correct way to organize a supply shelf so the weight was distributed toward the back, and nothing would topple forward when the front items were removed. The voice was not loud. It was even-toned and specific, and had the quality of someone accustomed to being heard without needing to raise their volume. He stood there for a moment longer. Then he walked on. Edmund, when Kalen arrived at his office later, was filing correspondence in the organized system that only Edmund fully understood. They worked through the afternoon's items efficiently. Edmund drafted the formal response to the Stonebrook leader. They reviewed the Northern Border Patrol reports, which documented 3 minor incidents that had been handled competently by the local patrol commanders without requiring central intervention. They discussed the winter supply budget adjustment that Edmund had already arranged. At the end of the meeting, when Edmund was gathering his documents, Kalen asked what he knew about the Greyfen Borderland Pack. Edmund looked up. "Small community," he said. "Far north, not formally counted in the territory's official records. They've maintained independent status since before the current territorial arrangement was established. Elder Wynn has led them for about 20 years. No formal alliances on record. No disputes on record. Population is probably under 40. Kalen said, "Is that everything?" Edmund said, "I can pull the full historical record, if it would be useful." Kalen said, "It would not be necessary at this time." Edmund picked up his documents. He said nothing else. But as he turned to leave, Kalen noticed that he had written something in the margin of his record book, 2 or 3 words, brief and deliberate, before closing it. He didn't ask what it was. He wasn't sure he wanted to know yet. The afternoon continued. Kalen did his work. He handled his correspondence and his decisions and his meetings with the same competence that 6 years of practice had built into his daily operation. He was genuinely good at the work. He had always been good at the work, even on the days when it was the only thing holding the architecture of his life in a recognizable shape. By late afternoon, he took his usual walk through the outer courtyard. The courtyard at this hour was largely territory of the working staff, people on break, maintenance workers cutting between tasks, delivery workers completing late runs. It was a colder and less decorated space than the formal grounds, and it had a quality at this hour that the formal parts of the court never quite achieved. It simply looked like what it was. He was walking along the south wall when he saw her. She was in the supply yard at the far corner, checking a delivery against a manifest. From across the courtyard he could see that something was wrong with the delivery, and she was handling it. She wasn't aggressive. She wasn't performing patience. She was pointing clearly to something on the manifest, asking specific questions, and holding her position with the complete steadiness of someone who knows they are correct and doesn't need to perform certainty to maintain it. The delivery man argued briefly. She let him finish. Then she said something, calmly and specifically, and the delivery man made a note in his book and said he would send the correct items in the morning, and she said she would need them by 5 rather than the usual 7 because of the kitchen schedule, and he started to object, and she said she understood the difficulty, but 5 was what they needed, and she wanted to confirm he had the capacity to manage it before she released him. He said he would manage it. She said thank you, and stepped back from the cart. The whole exchange had taken perhaps 4 minutes. Kalen realized he had stopped walking. He started again, turned to continue along the wall, and made sure he was moving before she looked up from her clipboard. That evening he sat at his desk and read the patrol reports properly for the first time all week. Afterward he wrote 2 letters. One to the Stonebrook pack leader confirming the selection would conclude within 5 days. One to his sister in the Southern Territory, who wrote to him consistently and whose letters he was sometimes slow to answer. He told his sister things were well. He told her the court was busy. He hesitated over the last paragraph for a while, and then wrote that he was in the middle of thinking about something he didn't yet have the right words for, and that he would write again when he did. He sent both letters. He opened the desk drawer and took out the kitchen staff list and looked at her name for a moment. Then he put it back and went to bed. He did not sleep quickly. In the morning, when Edmund arrived at the usual hour, Kalen looked up from his desk and said, "She's in the kitchen." Edmund said, "Most mornings before 5, yes." He said it the way Edmund said most things, placing the information in the air and leaving it there without instruction or interpretation. Kalen looked at him for a moment. Edmund looked back. Kalen said, "The Alliance correspondence should be the first priority today." Edmund said, "Of course," and opened his book and began to write. It was Edmund who first used the word notice, and he used it in the indirect way he communicated everything he considered delicate. He was filing correspondence one morning and said, without looking up from his work, that several members of the court staff had observed the king passing through the service corridor more frequently than before. Kalen was reading a trade report. He said he was aware. Edmund said that the service corridor was also the main route for kitchen supply runs. Kalen said he was aware of that as well. Edmund closed his file and said, "I'm noting it, my king, not objecting to it. I note things. It is what I do." Kalen set down the trade report. He said, "What do you actually want to say, Edmund?" Edmund said he wanted to observe that a king who had spent 3 years after a particular private difficulty, maintaining a very careful and consistent distance from personal investment, was now demonstrating repeated, deliberate interest in the movements of a kitchen worker. He said he was not qualified to assess whether this was a problem or an opportunity. He thought Kalen was better placed than anyone to make that determination. Then he went back to his filing. Kalen sat with that for a moment. Then he picked up the trade report. He read 2 sentences and put it down. He said, "She treats everything like it matters the same amount. Supply disputes, burned wrists, morning fires. She doesn't arrange things by importance based on who is watching." Edmund said, "No, I don't imagine she does." Kalen said, "Most people I've spent significant time with in this court arrange everything based on who is watching." Edmund said, "Yes. And then, after a pause, I had the same quality noted about you, once, by your father. He said you were the only person in the room who behaved the same whether he was present or not." Kalen was quiet for a moment. He said, "He never told me that." Edmund said, "No, he told me. He said it was the quality he was most proud of, and the one he was most worried about, because it tends to make people lonely." The conversation ended there. Edmund went back to his correspondence. Kalen went back to the trade report, and this time managed to read it properly. But the words his father had said, preserved for years in Edmund's careful memory, and delivered now at exactly the right moment, settled somewhere quiet inside him, and stayed there. He changed his morning walk route without announcing it. He began passing through the outer courtyard at the hour when the kitchen staff took their break, not every day, not obviously, but often enough to be present in the spaces where she moved. He told himself he simply preferred the fresh air on that side of the building. This was partly true, and he knew it was only partly true, and he accepted that honest knowing as the price of honesty in general. He watched her from the window of his study, on a day when the winter light was flat and gray, and the courtyard had the quality that makes everything look more honest than usual. She was in the supply yard with Edith, the young kitchen worker, showing her how the supply crates should be organized, not impatiently, with the patience of someone who knows a skill well enough to teach it in small, clear pieces, rather than all at once. Edith dropped something. Marin caught it before it hit the ground. She handed it back and said something too quiet to hear from above, and Edith laughed and they went back to work. He watched until the supply session finished and they went back inside. Then he turned from the window and went back to his desk and tried to read the morning's correspondence. 3 days later he watched her give away her midday meal. The kitchen staff ate in a small room off the main kitchen at noon. He had come through the adjacent corridor and the door was ajar. He could see a section of the room, a table, 4 people, simple dishes. He could see the moment when the young girl at the far end said something to Marin in a low voice, and Marin looked at her for a moment, and then slid her own untouched plate across the table. The young girl started to protest. Marin shook her head slightly, once, and said something quiet. The girl took the plate. Marin picked up her cup of water and sat quietly for the rest of the break with a kind of contentment that had nothing forced about it. He stepped away from the door and walked on, thinking about all the performances of generosity he had witnessed in the Silver Hall during the selection. The carefully mentioned charitable works, the strategic displays of consideration, generous things that were done, and then held up to the light to be assessed. And then this. A girl sliding her plate across a table and drinking her water, and not thinking about it again. On the morning of the 6th day after the corridor incident, he was on the mezzanine level of the main corridor, when he saw the incident with Millicent. Millicent was a tall woman from a well-connected pack in the Central Territory who had been at the court for 4 days. She had the manner of someone accustomed to being the most significant person in any given room, and mildly irritated when this went unacknowledged. She was walking through the lower corridor with 2 attendants, 4 across, taking up most of the corridor's width. Marin was coming from the other direction, carrying a tray. Someone was going to have to adjust. Millicent did not adjust. Marin moved to the wall, but the gap was too narrow, or Millicent moved toward her rather than away. From above, Kalen could not see the precise moment of contact, but he saw the result. The tray tilted, several covered dishes slid, and the contents of one of them hit the floor. Millicent stopped. She looked at the mess. She looked at Marin, who was standing with the now empty tray and the remaining dishes, and she said something that he couldn't hear from above. He didn't need to hear it. He could see the way Marin held still. He could see the particular stillness of someone receiving something sharp and choosing not to react to it outwardly. He could see the slight tension in her shoulders, and the way her hands on the tray stayed steady despite everything. He could see Millicent look at the floor once more, and then turn and walk away, as if the entire interaction was already behind her. He could see Marin set the tray against the wall, kneel on the corridor floor, and begin collecting the spilled dishes alone. He stood on the mezzanine and watched that for a moment. Then he turned and walked to his study and sent for Gerald. Gerald arrived within 10 minutes. Kalen told him that the candidate Millicent's presence at the court was no longer required. He said he wanted her and her party notified by this evening and departed by morning. Gerald said, "May I ask the reason?" Kalen said, "She has shown herself to be unsuitable." Gerald looked at him carefully. He said, "I see." Kalen said, "I want it handled directly and without unnecessary detail." Gerald bowed and left. Millicent and her party departed the following morning. The court absorbed this with the composure of a place accustomed to things happening without full explanation. People noted it and speculated. Nobody connected it to a spilled tray in a corridor. Marin heard the next day that one of the candidates had left unexpectedly. She absorbed this the way she absorbed most information about the formal wings, with quiet peripheral awareness, not particularly invested. She filed the Millicent departure in the section of her mind labeled "Not My Business" and went on with her day. Kalen, meanwhile, was having a growing internal conversation with himself about what exactly he was doing. He was not naive about his own behavior. He had spent days finding reasons to be near places where she might be. He had watched her from windows and doorways. He had requested personnel information about her. He had arranged the removal of someone who had treated her badly. He had not approached her or spoken to her again. He had not created obligation or expectation. But he also understood that he was a man with an enormous amount of power in a space where she had very little, and that something more needed to happen than watching from a distance if he was going to understand what this was. The watching was honest, but it was not enough. He wanted to talk to her. He couldn't send for her formally or arrange another accidental meeting. He had to find a moment that was real. He had to let it arrive without engineering it. On the 8th evening after the collision, he was taking his late walk through the West Passage when he turned left at a junction instead of right, and the left-hand path led him to the entrance of the outer kitchen, and inside the outer kitchen, there was a low fire and a warm light, and in the warm light, a woman was sitting on a stool, with a needle and thread, repairing the cuff of her uniform jacket. She was humming something quietly, a simple melody, with the ease of someone who thinks they are entirely alone. He stepped into the entrance. She looked up. She caught the sharp breath of surprise quickly, and settled into stillness. She looked at him. Her face held the careful, considered expression he was beginning to recognize as her version of thinking before speaking. He said good evening. He said he was sorry to interrupt, and he could leave if she preferred. She said he was welcome to stay if he wanted to. Her voice was steady. She went back to her stitching. He came in properly, and sat down on the low wooden bench against the wall. He folded his hands together and looked at the fire. It was quiet, a genuine quiet, not the performed quiet of rooms where people are carefully not saying things. The kind of quiet that exists between two people who don't know each other yet and are not pretending otherwise. After a minute, he asked how long she had been at the Silver Court. She said 3 weeks now. He asked if she had come for the selection. She looked at him briefly without turning her head fully, a sideways look. She said no. She was kitchen support. For the food, not the event. She said, "I noticed you know who I am." He said, "Yes." She said, "I didn't know who you were in the corridor. I found out later." He said, "I know." She said, "I would have treated it the same way either way." He said he believed her. She looked at him directly then, not with challenge, just with directness, the look of someone checking whether a thing is actually true. Then she went back to her stitching. He said, "What do you think of the selection?" She was quiet for a moment. Her hands kept working. She said she didn't think she had enough information to have a useful opinion, since she had seen the candidates only in passing, not in the formal hall itself. He said, "From what you've seen in passing, then." She finished a section of the stitch and pulled the thread through carefully. Then she said, "I think some people work so hard at showing their best that they forget what their best actually looks like." He was very quiet. She said, "That's not a criticism. It's something I've noticed. People perform for different reasons, and most of the reasons are understandable. They want to be safe. They want to be chosen. They've spent enough time being overlooked that showing their best felt like the only way to be seen. Most performances come from a real place. They just lose the real thing somewhere along the way." He said, "Can I ask you something?" She said yes. He said, "What do you want? Not from the court or from the selection. For yourself. What do you want from your life?" She stopped stitching. She looked at the fire. She held the jacket in her lap and was very still, and he could see that the question had reached her in a way she was not entirely prepared for, not because it frightened her, but because it was a question she did not get asked. He could see her taking it seriously, not reaching for a quick answer, but sitting with it honestly. After a long pause, she said, "To be somewhere I don't have to make myself small." He looked at her. She said, "I've been small for a long time. Quiet and careful and easy to overlook. It was useful. It got me through things. But it's not the same as a life. And I know there's a difference, even if I haven't found the second one yet." He said, "What would not small look like?" She thought about this. She said, "I think it looks like someone listening to you the way you'd listen to something that mattered, not performing interest, actually listening." She looked at him briefly. She said, "The way you're listening right now, actually." He held her gaze for a moment. She looked back at the fire and resumed her stitching, and the air between them settled into easy quiet again. He said, "Where are you from?" She said, "Grayfen, northern borderland, small pack. You won't find it on most maps." He said, "I know where it is." She looked at him. He said, "I looked it up." She said, "Why?" He said, "I wanted to know." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she said, quietly, "Oh." Just that word, but it held something in it, something that was turning a fact over carefully and deciding what to do with it. He asked if she missed home. She said, "Parts of it, the smells, the particular way the light comes through the trees in the morning. Elder Wynne, who writes to me, and always puts in a pressed flower even though she would never admit she does it on purpose." He said, "What is she like?" Marin said, "She is the kind of person who says very little and means everything she says, and whose silence tells you as much as the words." He smiled slightly. She caught it. She said, "You know someone like that." He said, "I am someone like that. Apparently." She looked at him. She said, "Yes, I noticed." Something shifted in the room. Not dramatically, just a slight change in the temperature of the air between two people who have been at a careful conversational distance and find it, without either of them moving, has shortened. She asked him, "What do you want? For yourself?" He looked at the fire for a long moment. He said, "I want one conversation that I didn't see coming. One morning where something happened that I hadn't already prepared for. I want to be in a room with someone and not spend the whole time understanding their angle." He said it plainly. She said, "That sounds very lonely." He said, "It has been." She didn't perform sympathy or fill the space with reassuring sounds. She sat with what he had said, and the fire burned lower, and the night outside was cold and still. Then she said, "I understand lonely, but mine is different from yours. Yours is lonely in a full room. Mine is lonely in an empty one." He said, "Which is worse?" She said, "I think they're the same. The shape is different, but the weight is the same." He said, "Yes." They sat in the quiet kitchen for a long time after that. He asked her small things, whether she preferred mornings or evenings, what she ate when she had a choice, whether she had brothers or sisters. She answered everything simply, without making anything grand. She asked him small things in return, not large probing questions, just ordinary ones. He answered them the same way she did, plainly. The fire burned lower. The kitchen cooled slightly. He didn't notice the time passing. At some point she said she should put the fire out for the night. He said he should go back. Neither of them moved for a moment. Then she got up and began settling the fire down properly. He stood. He was not sure what to say, which was unusual for him. He was not often at a loss for how to end a meeting, but this was not like other meetings. He said, "Thank you for the conversation." She looked at him over her shoulder and said, "I've never been thanked for a conversation before." He said, "Has anyone been worth thanking?" She considered this and said, "1 or 2 people." He said, "I'll try to be worth it." She turned back to the fire. He walked out into the cold corridor and walked all the way back to the North Tower in the dark, and he felt, for the first time in a very long time, the specific feeling of having arrived somewhere. Not a place, but a moment. A quality of presence that he had been searching for without knowing what to call it. In the outer kitchen, Marin finished putting out the fire, checked the dry stores, and walked back to the staff corridor. She lay down on her bed and thought about the question he had asked. "What do you want?" And the answer she had given, which was the truest thing she had said to anyone in months. She thought about the way he had listened, not with the careful patience of someone managing their response, with actual attention, the kind that pulls on you slightly from the other side. She told herself to go to sleep. She did not sleep quickly. The court was not a subtle instrument. It was enormous and complex, and managed by people who were genuinely good at their work, but it was also a structure, containing several hundred human beings in close proximity, and the natural consequence of several hundred human beings in close proximity is that things which are happening become known, not always accurately, not always quickly, but reliably. By the end of the second week after the fireside conversation, what was happening had become known. The king had been observed walking through the kitchen corridor again. The king had been seen in the outer courtyard at the hour when kitchen staff took their break. The king had been in the outer kitchen late on a particular evening. This last piece of information was known because the guard at the West Service exit had looked through the window when he heard voices and had mentioned it, in complete confidence, to one other person, and that person had mentioned it in confidence to 2 others, and within 4 days, it was in the hearing of people who had no particular reason to keep it quiet. Gerald came to Edmund. He came to Edmund because he understood that going directly to Kaelin would achieve nothing except an instruction to handle it, and a coolly delivered statement that the matter was personal. He came into Edmund's office, closed the door, and said without much preamble, "Has the king spoken to you about what is happening?" Edmund said, "The king speaks to me about many things." Gerald said, "Edmund." Edmund put down his pen and looked at him and said without expression, "Yes." Gerald sat down and laid out his concerns methodically. The political situation was delicate. The selection had already taken longer than expected. 3 alliance negotiations were in uncertain suspension. The candidates who remained at court or had returned to their packs came from families with significant territorial weight. Any signal about the king's intentions before a formal announcement would cause serious problems. He said, "And there are reports that his attention is on a kitchen worker." Edmund said, "They're not reports." Gerald looked at him. Edmund said, "They are accurate observations." Gerald was quiet. He said, "A kitchen omega from the Greyfen borderland." Edmund said, "Yes." Gerald sat back. He rubbed his face with one hand, a gesture Edmund had never seen from him before, which said something about the depth of the concern. He said, "I need to bring this formally to the council." Edmund said, "I know." Gerald said, "It will put the king in an uncomfortable position." Edmund said, "He's aware it will." Gerald looked at him. He said, "You've already told him." Edmund said, "He told me." Gerald left and put together a formal council note and requested an emergency session for the following morning. The session happened. Kaelin sat at the head of the table and listened to Gerald's carefully constructed presentation of the political situation and the concerns it raised. He asked questions when he needed to and said very little else. At the end, Gerald looked at him and asked directly, "Is the king pursuing a personal connection with a member of the kitchen staff?" Kaelin said, "Yes." The room was silent. Kaelin said he understood the concerns and would address them in due course, and he thanked the council for their time, and ended the session with the calm of a man who is very close to making the hardest decision of his tenure, and has already begun making his peace with it. But the council session was not what broke Marin, even briefly. What broke Marin happened in the servants' corridor on a Tuesday morning. She was coming from the supply room with a box of dried goods when two women came toward her from the opposite direction. She recognized them. Harriet, the soft-voiced woman from the North Fen pack who had been at the selection from the beginning, and Constance, from the Western Territories, older, who carried herself with the composed certainty of someone who has never been in doubt about where she stood. They stopped when they saw her. They positioned themselves in a way that was not quite blocking the corridor but close enough to narrow her path considerably. Harriet said she wanted to address the situation with complete openness and the best intentions. She said that Marin was a kitchen omega from a pack that didn't appear on most maps, and that she appeared to be giving an impression that she was involving herself in something that wasn't appropriate to her position. She said it was clear the king was curious about her, the way a person might be curious about something novel. But curiosity, she said, was not the same as consideration. Marin would save herself a great deal of difficulty and embarrassment by stepping back before things became something she could not manage. Constance said nothing. She simply stood there with an expression that conveyed, more effectively than words, that she agreed with every syllable. Marin looked at Harriet. She looked at Constance. Her hands on the supply box were steady, and her face did not change. She said, "I haven't done anything to either of you." Harriet's expression shifted slightly. She said, "We're simply trying to help you understand what you are." Marin said, "I know what I am." And she walked past them, with the box, and went back to the kitchen. She worked through the morning. She was precise and attentive, and completed every task correctly and on time, and did not let any of it show on her face. At the mid-morning break, she took the supply box to the storage room at the back of the kitchen, the small room that nobody used much, where old equipment was stored, and which smelled of dust and old clay. She set the box down on a shelf. She pressed the back of her hand against her mouth, and she let herself cry for a few minutes, in the quiet and the dark, the way she did everything, without sound, without spectacle, simply feeling what she felt and allowing it to be real, without making it bigger than it was. What they had said was not untrue in the mathematical sense. She was an omega from a pack that wasn't on most maps. She was kitchen support staff, with no formal standing, and no alliance value. These were facts. What they had been trying to do with those facts was the part that hurt. She had heard variations of it before. She had survived all of them. She wiped her face. She straightened up. She stood in the dusty storage room for a moment longer, breathing evenly, and then she opened the door and went back into the kitchen and picked up the work again. She did not tell anyone what had happened. But that evening, when she went to bed, the space where the tears had been was occupied by something else, something quieter and harder and more settled. It had the quality of a decision. She wasn't entirely sure what the decision was yet, but it felt like the point at which a person stops arranging herself around other people's expectations and begins to consider whether she actually wants to keep doing that at all. She thought about his question. "What do you want?" "To be somewhere I don't have to make myself small." She lay in the dark and thought about that answer, and felt, for the first time, that it was not just a wish, it was a direction. And directions, unlike wishes, required movement. Oliver had served the Silver Court for 41 years. He had arrived as a young man of 22, with a talent for organization, and a memory that retained information with a precision most people could not achieve, even with careful notes. He had worked in the records office under two previous archivists, had taken over the role himself at 35, and had spent the decades since becoming the most complete repository of institutional memory the Silver Court had ever had. He knew the history of every formal decision made under the white Lycan banner going back 4 generations. He knew the genealogy of every pack that had maintained any relationship with the throne. He knew which alliances had held and which had failed, and what had caused either. He knew the formal records of every significant event in the court's history, and he knew, perhaps more relevantly, a great many things that had not made it into formal records, but had nonetheless happened, and shaped everything that came after. He was 73 now, small and precise and white-haired, with the particular quality of very old people who have given their lives to work they believed in, a kind of dignified contentment that was entirely separate from happiness or unhappiness, and seemed to exist on its own plane. He came to find Marin on a Wednesday afternoon, 3 days after the corridor confrontation with Harriet and Constance. He found her in the supply yard, checking a delivery against a manifest. She looked up when she heard his footsteps and saw a small, white-haired man she did not recognize, and she waited. He introduced himself by name and role. He said he wondered if she might have a few minutes for a conversation when she had finished her current task. She finished the delivery check efficiently, signed the manifest, and said she had some time now. He walked with her to the small record room adjacent to the main archive, a comfortable room lined with organized shelves, containing a work table and 2 chairs, and the particular smell of old paper that Marin associated with careful keeping. He sat down across from her and folded his hands on the table. He said, "I'm going to tell you something that is not in the formal records. Not because it was hidden, because it was private, and private things don't always become records." Marin said she was listening. He said, 6 years ago, the king was in a relationship. He said her name was Nora. She was from a high-ranked pack in the Eastern Territory, chosen through a formal introduction process that the previous council had arranged. She was 24 years old. She was brilliant, composed, and immediately respected by everyone at the court. He said, she had a quality that I believe the king had not encountered before. She appeared to be genuinely interested in him. She asked him real questions. She listened when he talked. She found his silences comfortable rather than difficult. For a man who had spent most of his life in a position where people saw only the crown, this was significant. It was the thing he had not known he was missing until it arrived, and then it felt like the most natural thing in the world. He said the relationship developed over 3 years. He said the king became more open during those years, less careful about the distance he kept between himself and other people. He began to trust in the way that a person who has been very guarded about trust does when they finally let themselves. Deeply and completely, without the panel of glass he usually kept between himself and the world. He stopped. He said, "I will say this plainly and only once. Nora had been in correspondence with a representative of a rival pack in the Northern Territories since before she came to the Silver Court. The correspondence concerned the transfer of certain territorial information and rights in exchange for a formal position in the rival pack structure, a position accessible to her after the king's authority had been sufficiently undermined to create an opportunity for transition." He let that sit for a moment. He said, she did not want him. She wanted access to what he represented. She was not personally unkind, and I want to be accurate about that. I do not believe she was a cruel person, but she had designed the entire relationship as a means to an end, and she had executed that design with extraordinary care and consistency for 3 full years. Marin was completely still. She was looking at the table. He said, when it was discovered through routine intelligence review that found the correspondence, the king was told directly. He did not respond outwardly in any extreme way. He went quiet. He spoke to her once, briefly, in private. She left the court within the week. He said, and since then, the openness I described, the trust, has been gone. Not entirely gone, but gone enough that everyone who knew him before, and knows him now, can feel the difference clearly. Marin looked up. Oliver said, I have observed many things in 41 years. I observed what happened 6 years ago and I observed what followed. And I am observing now, for the first time since then, something that resembles, not the same thing, not a return to what was before, but the beginning of something new. He does not give his attention carelessly. He never has. The pattern of his attention these past 2 weeks is not something I recognize from his general behavior. I thought you should know why that matters. Marin was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, why are you telling me this? You don't know me. Oliver said, I know enough. Louisa spoke to me. Edmund spoke to me. And I have watched you myself for 2 days. You are careful and honest, and you don't want things from people that haven't been offered to you. He said, I am not asking you to do anything with this information. I am simply making it available to you, because information is what allows people to make real decisions instead of assumed ones. He stood up, said good afternoon, and left. Marin sat in the record room alone for a while. She thought about what Oliver had described, the 3 years of it, the design of it, the careful, consistent performance of someone who had learned exactly how to appear genuine without being it. She thought about what it would do to a person who had given their trust completely and then found it had been taken for reasons that had nothing to do with them. She thought about silver eyes watching a fire, She thought about, it has been. She thought about what it costs a person to say that plainly, without drama, without asking for anything in return, just as a fact. This is what my life has been. She got up from the chair and walked back to the kitchen. She worked through the afternoon. After the dinner service was finished and the kitchen was being cleaned and the staff was winding down to the end of the shift, she stayed at the bread station. She mixed flour and water and a small amount of the good salt she kept in a tin for her own use. She shaped the dough carefully. She set it to rise and then baked it slowly in the evening's low oven. While it was baking, she sat on a stool and thought about nothing in particular, which was her way of thinking about everything at once. When the bread was ready, she took it out and let it cool for 10 minutes. It was small, plain, the kind of loaf you make when you want the bread itself to speak rather than anything added to it. She wrapped it in a clean cloth from the stack near the drying rack. She walked to the north corridor. She had made supply runs through this route before and she knew it well. Past the west passage, up the service stairs, along the north corridor to the junction. The king's study was at the end of the north corridor, and she had passed it in the dark enough times on evening rounds to know it by the faint light that came under the door when he was working late. The light was there. She set the bread on the floor outside the door, settled it carefully so it wouldn't shift, and then stood up and walked back the way she had come without pausing. She did not write a note. There was nothing she needed to say in words that the bread didn't say better, simply by being there. Back in the kitchen, she washed her hands, said goodnight to Louisa, and went to bed. Inside the study, she heard nothing of what happened next. Kalen was at his desk with a border administration document he had been working through for an hour. He heard the soft sound in the corridor, barely audible, the particular quality of careful movement rather than accidental noise, and then nothing. He sat at his desk for a minute, then he opened the door. The corridor was empty in both directions. There was a small loaf of bread on the floor in front of the door, wrapped in clean cloth. It was still warm. He picked it up. He stood in the doorway for a long time. He thought about who had been in this corridor in the past year, who might leave bread outside his door without a note. He did not have to think for long. He went back inside and set the bread on the corner of his desk, not on the reports, not pushed aside to make room, in a place where he could see it clearly. He sat down. He did not pick up the border document again. He sat with his hands flat on the desk and looked at the small wrapped loaf, and thought about what it meant to be a person who bakes bread in the middle of the night and leaves it for someone without any expectation attached to the leaving. No note, no instruction, no message except the bread itself, which said, "I was thinking of you, and I wanted to do something about it, and this was what I had." He sat in his study for a very long time. The bread stayed warm for longer than he expected. Kalen called Edmund to his chambers 3 days later. Not to his office, where formal discussions happened. To his chambers in the North Tower, the private rooms that very few people entered by invitation, and almost no one entered without one. Edmund came in with his record book and looked around briefly, because coming to the king's chambers rather than the study meant this was a different kind of conversation. Kalen was standing at the window. He turned when Edmund came in. He said, "Sit down." Edmund sat. Kalen said, "I'm going to announce a decision to the council tomorrow morning. I wanted to tell you first." Edmund said, "I appreciate that." Kalen said he had thought about it carefully. He had thought about the political consequences, which were significant but manageable, and the personal consequences, which were uncertain but clear in the direction he was willing to accept. He had thought about what he owed the territory and what the territory could reasonably claim from him, and where the line existed between public responsibility and private life for a man in his position. He said, "The line exists. I've spent 6 years trying to be useful and honest and effective as a king, and I believe I have been. I believe I will continue to be. But I am not going to allow the crown to be the only thing in my life that gets to make a decision." Edmund said nothing. Kalen said her name. Edmund was quiet for a moment. Then Edmund said, "She agreed." It was not quite a question. Kalen said, "I haven't asked her yet. I'm telling the council first." Edmund said, "That is a significant act of certainty on her behalf." Kalen said, "Yes, I know what I know." Edmund looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, "Are you all right?" The same question he always asked. Direct, simple. The question of someone who has been paying attention for a very long time. Kalen said, "Yes. More all right than I've been in some time. Edmund wrote something in his record book. He wrote it slowly, as if the words deserved their time. He said, "I'll make sure the chamber is arranged for 9 tomorrow morning." Then he said, "Good," and left. The council session the following morning opened in the usual way. Edmund had not told the other members what it was about. Gerald and Frederick and the 2 remaining senior members arrived at 9 and took their seats and looked at Kalen with the collective expression of men who knew something was coming. Kalen did not use preamble. He said the selection was formally concluded. He had made his choice. Gerald's posture shifted slightly, a contained relief. Frederick made a small note. Kalen said her name. The relief evaporated from Gerald's posture almost instantly. There was a silence that lasted several seconds. One of the senior members, a quiet man named Arthur who handled Northern Territorial records, and who rarely spoke in sessions unless he had something precise to contribute, asked Kalen to repeat the name. Kalen repeated it. Gerald said, "The kitchen worker." Kalen said, "Yes." Frederick said, "From the Grey Fen borderland." Kalen said, "Yes." Gerald said, "An Omega with no formal pack standing and no alliance value." Kalen said, "She has those qualities, yes." Gerald said, "My king, I need to be direct with you." Kalen said, "I've heard the objection, Gerald. You can say it, or you can save your energy. Either way, my answer is the same." Gerald said it anyway. He laid it out the way Gerald laid everything out, methodically and completely. The 3 suspended alliance negotiations. The Eastern and Northern packs whose daughters had participated in the selection, and who would view this outcome as a significant political slight. The precedent it would set. The questions it would raise about stability and succession. He covered all of it without raising his voice, because Gerald never raised his voice, and when he was finished, the room was very quiet. Kalen said, "I've heard all of that." Gerald said, "And?" Kalen said, "And I understand it, and I'm telling you anyway." He said it without anger, and without apology. He said it with the specific quality of someone who has located their own certainty, and is standing inside it, with both feet on the ground. He said, "I have given this throne everything it has asked of me. I will continue to. The alliances can be renegotiated. The pack leaders can be managed with respect and transparency. The political consequences are real, and I will address every one of them. But the crown does not decide this. I have let it decide too many things for too long, and I am finished with that." Frederick said, "You'll lose the Stonebrook negotiation." Kalen said, "I'll rebuild it." Gerald said, "2 of the Eastern packs will withdraw their trade agreements temporarily." Kalen said, "Temporarily is a word I can work with." Arthur said, quietly, from his corner, "I have served this court for 27 years. 3 kings. I have never heard one of them speak in this room about a decision with this quality of certainty." Everyone looked at him. Arthur said, "I am noting it, not evaluating it." He went back to his notes. The session continued for another hour. Gerald submitted a formal objection in writing, as was his right, and Kalen received it with respect and said it would be included in the record. When the session ended, 2 of the 5 council members submitted letters of formal concern. These were received with equal respect. The consequences began arriving that afternoon. Pack leader Aldrich of Stonebrook sent a messenger with a formal withdrawal from the pending alliance negotiation. One of the Eastern pack families sent a letter, with language more direct than usual diplomatic correspondence allowed. Kalen read it himself and asked Edmund to draft a response that acknowledged their position without conceding his. The selection candidates who remained were formally notified. Edmund wrote each letter personally, with the particular care of a man who understands that the way you communicate disappointing news shapes its reception. Harriet departed with composure, and very little said. Cecily departed with a dry observation to her attendant that she had told someone this was how it would go, and had not been wrong. Vivian read the letter twice, set it on her desk, and sat quietly for a long time before she began to prepare to leave. Constance, who had stood beside Harriet in the servants' corridor and said nothing while Harriet spoke, read her notification, packed her things, and departed the following morning without a word to anyone, which was, in its own way, a form of grace. Kalen handled every consequence with the composure he had brought to the announcement. He was honest about what he was doing and why, without excessive explanation. He was, as he had always been, a man who did difficult things without dramatizing them or pretending they were easy. That evening he looked for her. The kitchen was being cleaned after the dinner service, and Louisa was overseeing the end-of-day routine. He appeared in the kitchen doorway with the particular quality of a man who is trying not to look like he is looking for something. Louisa looked at him directly and said, "She's in the back storage room, the one at the very end, the one that smells like old clay." He said, "Thank you, Louisa." Louisa said nothing further, and went back to her work. He went to find her. She heard footsteps in the storage corridor and went still. It was late. The main kitchen sounds had quieted to the winding down sounds of a large operation coming to a stop. The storage room at the back was always quiet at this hour. She came here sometimes when she needed to be somewhere that nobody expected her to be, to sit with whatever she was processing, without the noise of the rest of the world pressing on it. She had been sitting on a low crate in the dim room, not doing anything in particular, just sitting. The past several days had contained a great deal she was working through, and slowly was the only speed available to her right now. The footsteps stopped outside the door. A knock. Brief, not demanding. The knock of someone who intends to wait for permission. She said, "Come in." The door opened and light came in from the corridor, and then Kalen, in plain clothes, no formal coat, nothing ceremonial about him at all. He looked like someone who had come straight from his own rooms, which was exactly what had happened. He looked around the small room, then at her on the crate. He said, "I was told you might be here." She said, "Louisa." He said, "Yes." She said, "She knows where everyone is. It is one of her skills." He said, "Yes." He came into the room properly and sat down on the low shelf along the wall, which put him at about her eye level. Neither of them spoke immediately. He said, "I've told my counsel. This morning, I made a formal announcement." She said, "What kind of announcement?" He said, "The kind where I told them I had made my decision about the selection." She was very still. He said, "You should know that before I ask you anything. The announcement has been made. The consequences have started arriving, and I am dealing with them, and will continue to deal with them. I'm not telling you this to apply any kind of pressure. I'm telling you because you deserve to know the current state of things before I say anything else." She said, "You told your counsel before you talked to me." He said, "Yes." She said, "Why?" He said, "Because I didn't want the possibility of your answer affecting my decision. I wanted you to know that the decision was made without depending on you to make it, and that whatever you say to me tonight, the decision is already made and it will not change." She looked at him for a long moment. She said, "That's a strange way to do it." He said, "I know. I've been told I do some things strangely." She said, "By who?" He said, "Edmund. Mostly Edmund." She almost smiled. He said, "May I say some things?" She said, "Yes." He said, "I want to say them plainly, without a speech prepared, without managing how they come across. If something comes out wrong, I'll try to correct it, but I'd rather say it poorly and honestly than say it well and carefully." She said, "I understand." He said, "I've been thinking about 3 minutes in a service corridor since the night they happened. I've thought about them more than I've thought about 3 days of a formal selection that took 2 years to arrange. That is not a small thing, and I know it isn't, and I've tried to be honest with myself about whether it means something real or whether it's something I'm constructing, because I was tired and needed contrast. I don't think it's contrast. I think it's specific. I think it's you, specifically, and not just the relief of an unscripted moment, because it hasn't faded. Contrast things fade." She was listening without moving. He said, "I have watched you for 2 weeks, not as someone conducting an assessment, because I couldn't stop. I've watched you give away your food and handle supply disputes with complete precision and teach a young girl the morning fire routine with a patience you didn't have to have. I've watched you receive things that were unkind, without collapsing and without pretending they didn't land. I watched you in the outer kitchen by a fire, and I had the first conversation in I don't know how long, where I wasn't watching for the angle." He said, "And someone left bread outside my study door. I don't know what I was expecting, but it was not that. And I have thought about it every day since." He stopped. He said, "I want to say something else, about why this matters to me in a particular way." He told her about Nora. He didn't go into extensive detail, not because he was protecting himself from the telling of it, but because the specific dimensions of a betrayal don't need to be cataloged to communicate what it cost. He said there was someone, 6 years ago. He said she had known exactly how to appear genuine and had maintained it for 3 years, and he had believed it completely. He said that when he found out, what he felt was not the anger people expected. He felt the particular loneliness of someone who has discovered that the most real thing in his life at that time had been constructed from the beginning. He said, "What that teaches you is to look at everyone through glass, behind a panel that you can see through, but nothing can cross. I have been behind that panel for 6 years. It served me well in many ways. It cost me a great deal in others." He said, "You are the first person in 6 years who has made me aware of the panel, who has made me feel that it might be possible to put it down." He paused. He said, "I know what I am. I'm not an easy person. I'm solitary, and I run very quiet, and I am better at managing a territory than I am at being known. I am difficult to be close to, and I have never been given to grand expressions, and sitting in a storage room telling you all of this is probably the grandest thing I've done in years, and I'm aware that's not saying much." She made a sound that was almost a laugh, and then covered it. He said, "I'm not asking you to fix anything. I'm asking whether you might want to be around while I figure out what to do with it." He said, "I need you to know the full extent of what I'm asking. There will be political difficulty. There are people who are already unhappy. There will be pressure, and people who will say things that are designed to cut, because that is what people do when they feel displaced, and I cannot always prevent it no matter how much I would like to." He said, "If you say no, you will have a home here, or wherever in the territory you choose, with a proper salary and complete security, and no obligation to me. You've done nothing to deserve a difficult life, and saying no to me will not create one. I will make sure of that personally." He looked at her. He said, "The choice is yours. It has always been yours. I just wanted to make sure you knew it existed." He stopped. He had said everything. The storage room was very quiet. The faint sounds of the kitchen settling at the end of the day came through the walls, and the light from the corridor was coming through the open door, and Marin was sitting on her crate in the dim and looking at him. She was not looking at the title, or the crown, or the throne. She was looking at the man sitting on a storage shelf in plain clothes in the back room of a kitchen, who had just said more than she suspected he had said to anyone in a very long time. She said, "I never asked your name. In the corridor. I wrapped your wrist and walked away, and I never asked." He said, "Kaylin." She said, "I know. I found out later." He waited. She said, "I didn't ask, because in that moment, you were just someone who needed cold water. That was the whole thing. I wasn't thinking about anything else." He said, "Yes." She said, "I've been making myself small for a long time. I know how to take up very little space and make very little noise, and be useful without being seen. I'm good at it. But I don't think being good at something is the same as wanting to keep doing it." She looked at him. She said, "I want the thing I said by the fire. The somewhere I don't have to make myself small. I want it to be real, not just a direction." She said, "I'm not going to pretend I know how any of this works, or what it looks like going forward. I don't, but I have spent 3 weeks in this court, watching people perform the fullest version of themselves for an audience, and the most real thing that has happened to me here was an accidental conversation in a service corridor, and a question you asked by a fire about what I wanted from my life." She said, "Yes. Just yes. Plain and without decoration, the word standing on its own." He was very still. Then he said, "Thank you." She said, "Don't thank me for something honest." And the corner of his mouth moved in a way that was more than a smile, and warmer, and more specific than any expression she had seen on his face before. The expression of a man who has been given something he had almost stopped believing he would ever have. She said, "I still have to do the morning fires." He said, "I know." He stood up from the shelf. She stood up from the crate. They were standing close enough in the small room that she could see the actual color of his eyes in the low light. Genuinely silver, the particular unusual shade that had surprised her in the corridor when she had looked up at him. He said, "I'll walk you back to the main kitchen." She said, "It's 20 steps." He said, "I know." He walked her back anyway. In the kitchen, the fires were banked, and the staff had gone. He stood in the doorway, and she stood a few feet inside, and they said goodnight, the way two people do, when goodnight is both simple and complicated at once. He walked back through the court in the dark. He stopped at Edmund's door and knocked once. Edmund opened it. Already dressed, because Edmund was always already dressed. Kaelin said. She said yes. Edmund looked at him for a long moment. Edmund said, "Good. Just good." The word sitting on its own, the way good things do when they don't need anything added to them. Kaelin said goodnight and walked back to the North Tower. He sat at his desk, and the border document he had been trying to read for a week was still there, and this time he read it properly, all the way through, with full attention. He went to bed at a reasonable hour. He slept. The weeks between the evening in the storage room and the day of the coronation were among the most complex the Silver Court had managed in years. The political situation required constant attention. Pack leader Aldrich's withdrawal from the Stonebrook negotiation was the most significant immediate consequence, and Kaelin handled it with the methodical calm he brought to every difficult situation. He sent Edmund to Stonebrook with a formal request for a meeting, prepared a comprehensive proposal for a revised alliance structure that addressed the Pack's core interests, and made clear that the throne's position was firm, but its interest in a mutually beneficial relationship was genuine. The meeting was scheduled. Edmund was cautiously optimistic. Kaelin was simply working, which was the only mode of operation he had ever fully trusted. Gerald, who had submitted his formal objection, and then continued showing up every morning and doing his job with the same thorough competence he always had, eventually came to see Kaelin privately. He said he had given his objection, and it was on record and he stood by it. He said he also served this line, and this throne, and this king, in that order, and he was not going to abandon that service over a disagreement whose conclusion he disagreed with but whose process he respected. Kaelin said he appreciated that. Gerald said, "I want to be on record as saying I hope it goes well. The court needs a king who functions. You haven't fully functioned for 6 years. Whatever she is or isn't in political terms, if she changes that, then it is to the territory's benefit." He bowed and left. Kaelin sat with that for a moment. Then he wrote it down, which was not something he usually did with personal things, and put it in the drawer with the kitchen staff list. Marin's transition from the kitchen to her own rooms in the East Wing happened gradually and at her pace. She had not expected to find the larger room difficult, and was surprised to discover that a part of her resisted it. The absence of Edith sleeping across the room. The different quality of the morning quiet. She told Kaelin this one evening when they were sitting in the North Tower study. Plainly, not as a complaint but as information. He said, "You can visit the kitchen." She said, "It's different when it's a visit." He said, "Yes. But things that change don't stop being themselves. The kitchen is still the kitchen. Edith is still Edith. They're different in their relation to you now, but they're not gone." She looked at him. She said, "You're better at talking about hard things than you think you are." He said, "I'm practicing." She sent for Edith the next morning, and they had breakfast together, in the small dining room adjacent to her new rooms. It was not the same as the shared staff room, and it was better in its own way, and after that, they had breakfast together twice a week, without either of them needing to comment on why. Louisa was given a formal household position, heading the kitchen staff that served the royal family's private rooms. She accepted it without ceremony, and ran it the same way she ran everything, with complete competence and very little drama. Edith was enrolled in a formal education program at Marin's direct request, which Kaelin authorized without hesitation. Edmund managed the administrative side and noted in his record book that the enrollment had been processed in under a day, which was unusual enough to be worth recording. The preparation for the coronation was a negotiation that Marin and Kaelin conducted in good humor and with occasional light disagreement. The court had traditional expectations about what a coronation involved, most of which were elaborate and required months of preparation. Marin said she wanted something smaller, not because she was ashamed or uncertain, but because the elaborate version was designed for an audience, and the thing that mattered to her was not the audience's experience of the moment. The thing that mattered to her was the moment itself. Kaelin said, "Tell me what you want." She said, "A room that can hold the people who actually know what is happening here. The kitchen staff should be inside, not outside. Edmund and Oliver should be near the front. Gerald should be there." He objected honestly, and stayed anyway, and that deserves something. She said, "Nothing performed, just true." Kaelin said, "Done." The coronation was held in the smaller of the court's two formal halls. Clean stone, simple winter light through tall windows, no imported decorations or elaborate arrangements. The kitchen staff, Louisa and her team, the supply workers, the assistants who had worked alongside Marin during those 3 weeks, were seated in proper chairs inside the hall, near the front. Edmund was 2 rows from the altar. Oliver was beside him, his white hair very bright in the winter light. Gerald was in the 3rd row. He had come in early, and sat straight-backed and attentive, the way Gerald always sat, and he had looked at Edmund once, when he took his seat, and Edmund had given him the particular nod that meant, yes, and here we are. Arthur, the court officiant, who had conducted every significant ceremony in the Silver Court for 30 years, stood at the front of the hall. He was 81 years old. He had seen a great deal. He began the ceremony with the formal words of his tradition, and his voice was steady throughout, and he did not change the words or add to them, but somewhere in the middle of the proceedings, his eyes became bright, in a way that the people nearest him noticed, because Arthur was not known for visible emotion, and this was the first time most of them had seen it in him. The hall was quiet, a full, genuine quiet. Several pack representatives who had objected to the outcome were present anyway, because not attending would have been a more significant statement than attending and saying nothing, and most of them were people who preferred to reserve significant statements for situations that truly required them. Vivian's father, General Lowell, had sent a formal acknowledgement of the coronation, and a brief, dignified note saying the Ashwood pack respected the throne's decision and looked forward to continued cooperation. Vivian herself had said nothing publicly, but her father had told Edmund, in the side communication between advisors that happens in every diplomatic relationship, that his daughter had come home from the court and said, "He was not choosing a candidate. He was choosing a person. I was not prepared for that." He told Edmund he thought the girl from the borderland must be something, to make a king announce her to his council before he even asked her. Edmund had written that down. When the crown was placed on Marin's head, the hall was completely still. It was a simple crown, narrower, and cleaner than the elaborate formal one. Marin had looked at the formal crown in its case, and said it was very beautiful, and she would prefer something a little less tall. The jewel makers had produced the cleaner design, and it was this that Arthur lifted and placed on her head with the traditional words. Kaelin, standing beside her, leaned close. He said something in her ear that no one else in the hall could hear. Whatever he said, it made her laugh. Out loud. Genuinely. The specific laugh of someone who was surprised and delighted and fully present, not performing any part of it. It was not a ceremonial sound. It was a real sound, a human sound, the kind that fills a room and catches everyone in it off guard, because they were expecting something solemn and received something completely true. The hall turned toward the sound. The white Lycan king, whose stillness had been so consistent that it had become a kind of court legend over 6 years, was smiling at the woman beside him who was laughing, and the smile was not the careful, controlled expression of someone being gracious in public. It was the unguarded expression of someone who is simply happy, the specific happiness of a man who has found what he was looking for, and knows it, and has stopped being surprised by it. In the back rows of the hall, the people who had said specific things in specific corridors to the woman now wearing the crown, watched this happen, and did not speak. There was nothing to say. What was in front of them was simply true, and true things have a quality that is very difficult to argue with once you have seen them clearly. Arthur completed the ceremony. His eyes were still bright at the very last word. Edmund, in the second row, watched with the expression of a man who has kept a great deal of information for a long time, and is watching it become relevant in the most important way. Oliver, beside him, held his record book in his lap, and wrote nothing in it. He simply watched. The years that followed were not simple years. They were years in which the political consequences of the selection's outcome were managed, mostly successfully, and some of the suspended alliances were rebuilt, and some were eventually replaced, by arrangements that worked better for the territory than the original ones would have. Aldrich of the Stonebrook pack became, within 2 years, one of the throne's most reliable allies, a development that surprised Gerald and had not surprised Edmund. Queen Marin developed a way of attending to her role that nobody had predicted, and many people eventually came to depend on. She was not loud in council. She did not dominate meetings or make speeches designed to impress. She listened with the particular completeness of someone who has spent a lifetime learning to hear what people are actually saying, rather than what they intend to say. She asked questions that were small and specific, and that often landed at the exact center of a complicated problem, and exposed the part that everyone had been carefully talking around. She had a particular interest in the welfare of people who had no formal standing, the low-ranked pack members, the workers in small border communities, the people whose concerns had never reached the formal machinery of territorial governance. In her second year, she proposed and managed the creation of a formal communication channel for these communities, a simple, accessible system through which concerns could be documented and directed to the appropriate governance structure. It was not complicated or expensive. It was simply a thing that nobody had thought worth building before she arrived. Gerald, who had opposed her coronation in writing and attended it in person and had worked alongside her for 3 years, said in a formal council session that the Queen's approach to certain governance problems was among the most effective he had observed in his career. He said it the way Gerald said everything, without elaboration, as a plain fact. Marin thanked him without making it a large moment, because she understood that Gerald communicated in facts, and the most respectful response was to receive the fact and move on. Kaelin changed, not into a different person. The king, who had always been competent and solitary and difficult to get close to, remained all of those things in their degrees. But the hollow quality that Edmund had noticed and quietly worried about for years slowly filled in, the way things fill in when they are finally given what they needed. He was seen laughing in public more than once, which caused a brief period of court uncertainty before people adjusted to it as a normal state of affairs. He was seen sitting in the kitchen on quiet mornings, with a cup of warm tea, watching Marin oversee the bread, and Louisa had accepted this with complete equanimity from the first day it happened. He began writing longer letters to his sister more frequently, which his sister told Edmund she found deeply suspicious, because her brother had never had much to say, and now appeared to have quite a lot. Edmund told her he understood the feeling. Oliver died at 78, 3 years after the coronation, in his record room, surrounded by his organized shelves and his carefully kept books. Edmund found him there in the morning, sitting in his chair, as if he had simply stopped between one breath and the next. He had left his record books in complete order, annotated through the previous week, the last entry dated the afternoon before. Edmund read the last entry, and then closed the book carefully, and reported Oliver's death to the king, with the measured composure of someone who has had a long time to understand that the people they care about will eventually leave. Kaelin had gone to the record room and sat in Oliver's chair alone for a few minutes. Then he had gone to find Marin and told her, and she had been quiet for a moment, and then she had said, "He gave me the most important information I have ever received." She said it simply, as the specific true thing it was. Letters began arriving at the Silver Court 5 years after the coronation. They came from places that didn't appear on most maps: borderland communities, small pack settlements. Young women who had heard a story through the particular unofficial channels through which real stories travel. The story had been embellished along the way, as all real stories are. Some versions had unnecessary elements added, and some significant details removed. But the core of it had survived intact, because the cores of real things usually do. The letters asked how she had done it. They asked what the secret was. Some were brave and direct. Some were careful and apologetic, as if the writer wasn't certain she had the right to ask. Marin read every one of them herself. She wrote back to each of them herself. Her answer was always the same, adjusted for who was asking and from what place, but always saying the same true thing. I was not trying to win anything. I was just being honest about who I was. I stopped hiding, and I let people see me plainly, and one person saw me and chose to stay. That is all it was. That is everything it was. She told them, "The hiding never actually keeps you safe. It just keeps you invisible." She told them, "Be visible." Edith, who had gone through the formal education program and had discovered a talent for research and argument that the kitchen had never provided sufficient room for, became one of the territory's most respected scholars by her mid-20s. She came back to the Silver Court twice a year. She always had breakfast with Marin on the first morning, in the small dining room, and they sat for hours and talked the way people talk when they genuinely want to know what the other person is thinking. Louisa retired at 62, and was given a formal recognition from the Crown, presented in a small private ceremony that Marin arranged. Louisa said, when the recognition was placed in her hands, "I've done my work, and that's enough." Marin said, "It is more than enough." and Louisa looked at her with the expression of someone who knows something important has happened in their life, and has made peace with how quietly it ended. The last letter Marin received in the 5th year of her reign came from a girl named Grace, from a borderland pack that had no formal name in any record. Grace was 12 years old. She had written in careful, deliberate handwriting, the writing of someone who had practiced this letter more than once before sending it. She said she had heard the Queen's story from someone who had heard it from someone else, and she wanted to know if it was true, and she wanted to know what you do when you feel too small to be noticed. And at the very end of the letter she asked, "But what if nobody chooses you?" Marin wrote back. She told Grace that you don't choose yourself for someone else. You choose yourself for you. You stop making yourself small, because you have decided that you have the right to take up space, not because you want someone to fill it for you. And everything else that follows, the people who arrive, the connections that form, the love that comes when it comes, is just the world catching up to a decision you already made. She told her, the world is slow sometimes, but it catches up. She told her, be patient with it. Be patient with yourself, and do not stop being visible while you wait. Kalen found her at her writing desk that evening, folding the letter into its envelope. He asked who she was writing to. She told him about Grace. He held out his hand, and she gave him the letter, and he read it standing in the middle of the room. He was quiet for a moment when he finished. He said, "You should have been a writer." She said, "I think I am." He said, "Fair enough." He handed the letter back and sat down beside her at the desk while she sealed it. Outside the North Tower window, the Silver Court was alive with its ordinary sounds. Horses in the courtyard, voices in the corridors, the particular hum of a large place going about its business at a winter evening's pace. Inside the room, the fire was going well, and the desk was lit, and two people sat together in the quiet that belongs only to them. The particular silence of people who have found what they were looking for, and do not feel the need to say so, because it is present in the room without being said. The envelope was sealed. The letter went out the next morning. In a borderland somewhere far to the north, in a small place that did not appear on most maps, a girl named Grace was waiting for an answer. It was already on its way.